getting into the groove of black British swing now at BBC Two Northern Ireland in a culture show special.
I've always been captivated by the sound of swing jazz. The fact that you can't hear it without wanting to tap your feet, or that glorious, brassy, big band sound that's so evocative of its era and a moment of dazzling musical freedom. Now, in the 21st century, London is swinging again, and a whole new generation of dancers are rediscovering the joys of the jive and the jitterbug. Think of swing as white music for white audiences, but beneath that story lies a remarkable tale of race, politics and society. In the late 1920s, a handful of trailblazing West Indian musicians arrived on these shores, and they helped shape the sound of the era. I thought it was high time we looked at this neglected chapter of musical history and rediscovered the black musicians who really made Britain swing. Music that came to define an era in Britain had its roots in Harlem. In the 1920s, African-American artists began experimenting with musical ideas and created their own radical new sound.
I think we're looking at a truly revolutionary, incendiary moment in human music history. And from the earliest examples of freed slaves playing music in Congo Square in New Orleans, and the blues and those traditions, those things coming together, there was, if you like, just an infectious mix of music that was destined to take over the world. Every kind of music has its own groove, and swing is that particular groove that's within jazz that makes you want to tap your feet. As Duke Ellington famously said, don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing.
For years, the British had swayed politely to the sound of light music at afternoon tea dances, but these were swept aside by the sheer energy of black American jazz, which not only inspired exciting new dances, but helped diminish painful memories of the First World War. British audiences became hungry to experience the sort of music and musicians that were thrilling Harlem, and it's this vibrant, transformational moment in history that Stephen Polyakov explores in his new drama series for BBC Two. Dancing on the Edge follows a fictional black swing band as they dazzle London's high society.
The Victorian Edwardian world that had led to this terrible slaughter and tragedy was being repudiated in all sorts of ways. The new was worship, and this was part of the new. This excitement and rawness and sexual energy was part of it. This fascinating moment in time when jazz music became fashionable amongst certain members of the aristocracy, the ruling elite, and the royal family, both visiting American black jazz musicians and homegrown, or people that made their careers here. And I thought that was an extraordinary insight into that time and a different angle on what obviously is a period famous for racism, anti-Semitism and all sorts of darkness.
Do you think the fact that these were black musicians appearing for the first time, was that, how much of that was part of it? Did they bring their own inflection to the music, or was it just the fact that for that audience to behold an all-black band was something, as you say, such an exotic spectacle in itself?
Well, it was unusual at that time in London hotels.
My nighttime dreams and desires.
The 30s, because of the terrible tragedy of the First War, embraced the new in all sorts of ways.
Very sexy. sexy, that music.
Yes.
I think we forget you're right,
No,
we don't
well,
tend to think of that music.
Well, that does bring us full circle. It is very sexy. That is precisely why a lot of these people were drawn to it at the time.
Gorgeous little singer. Love this jazz sound, don't you?
It was a very vibrant time in the music scene in London.
Dancing on the Edge draws its inspiration from the real black musicians and entertainers who arrived in London in the 1930s. At that time, the sight of black faces on Britain's streets was still something of a rarity, but two men in particular, both from the West Indies, although from very different backgrounds, would manage to break through the boundaries and have a profound impact on London's musical culture. Leslie Thompson, an innovative musician and celebrated trumpeter. And Ken Snake Hips Johnson, a brilliant dancer and charismatic band leader. When Ken and Leslie joined forces to create Britain's first black swing band, it was the beginning of both musical and social change. The possibilities of that were cut short when their story ended in tragedy at the height of the Blitz. But while it lasted, their phenomenal success was an inspiration to others and the birth of a new era where black musicians could take centre stage for the first time. This is the untold tale of two extraordinary men and the legacy of the music they helped create.
It was like being in heaven, the music like that. It lifted one, all the people that dancers, musicians, it lifted you completely, You left the club or whatever, feeling a different person, feeling satisfied and very happy with life,
It was a renaissance of black music at that period, at that time. It was the birth of West Indian black British music.
For the last 9 years, Leslie Thompson had been back in his native Jamaica. He was making his living playing music in the silent movie theatres, but when the talkies arrived in 1929, his career was suddenly under threat, and it was to Britain that he would turn to seek bigger musical opportunities.
We came here to work as a professional musician, which means dance bands, theatre, pit bands, show bands, perhaps making films, and that's what you could do.
Leslie hoped to make his living as a trumpeter, and like every other jobbing musician in London, he headed to Archer Street.
This narrow back street in Soho became a sort of unofficial labour exchange for freelance musicians. And with the older music hall players not exactly suited to the new music, which exploded all existing rules, it became about the next generation coming through. And this is the block on which those new kids gathered.
The scene was growing, and one musician remembers it well.
It was like this. You turned up in Archer Street and it was packed from one end to the next. And as you walk back, you see guys used to put their hands up like that. Got a gig for you. And this tells you how much, 5 or 10 or 15 pounds as the case may be, by the hands going, And that's the way we used to get our gigs.
The teenage Ken Johnson was also drawn to the capital, where he was pursuing his dream of becoming a dancer. Ken was ambitious and driven, and by 1934 he had even landed a role as a nightclub dancer in the British film Oh Daddy. Ken had been learning from the best, and his celebrated dance teacher Buddy Bradley helped him get the part.
Buddy Bradley, who was an African-American choreographer, very, very famous and very popular in England in the 1930s.
Bradley was choreographing the top West End shows and film musicals, and audiences loved them.
Buddy Bradley also ran a dance school, and everybody went to him to learn a few dance steps, and Ken would have learned from him.
So Ken Johnson was making a name for himself as a dancer, but he wanted more.
and this ambition would take him all the way across the Atlantic.
It's on record that Ken Snake Johnson visited New York in 1934 at the height of the popularity of the Cotton Club and the black bands.
I think his name was Smokey Joe, and he used to hide me.
Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Fletcher Henderson.
He met Fletcher Henderson, the most influential swing band leader of the mid-30s. Mr. Henderson said, here's a baton. Can you conduct the band? Go ahead. See, that's easy. When you go back, you should get a band. You could make some money. So that's all the encouragement he needed.
Ken returned to Britain with a new nickname and a new career. He was now Snake Hips Johnson, band leader.
He's young, handsome, and he had aspirations of really making it. And coming from what you would call traditional middle-class background, he really wanted to be a posh star, I think.
The jazz craze spread through London's West End, and high demand created more opportunities. Many West Indian musicians came to seek their musical fortunes in the UK, and a small but thriving artistic community sprang up. Earl Cameron, then a budding young actor, came over from Bermuda, attracted to the scene.
The Jigs Club, you've heard of the Jigs Club?
Yeah.
That was the real hangout place. Tractors, Bateman Street in Soho. La Java Club, that was on Old Compton Street. Jazz, all jazz music. First-class musicians, you know. You're up to Sousa, you're up to Sousa, the pianist. I knew them all, yeah. That's what London was like.
You were in competition, of course, but you were friends, of course, because you got to know most of them anyway. Or if you didn't get a chance to meet them, because of they played with such a band, you had a respect for them and you wanted to meet them.
Among this lively community, Ken Snake Hips and Leslie Thompson met and hatched a plan that would put their complementary talents to good use. In 1935, drummer Happy Blake put a West Indian band together to play at his Cuba Club, and now Ken and Leslie dared to dream of forming an all-black British swing band that could really make it to the top. Snake Hips may have stepped on a few toes along the way, but he was fast becoming a celebrity. By 1940, his group had been voted #1 swing band in Britain. And Snake Hips was interviewed by radio journalist Una Marson for her series Calling the West Indies on the BBC's Empire, now World, service.
So you left London a tap dancer and returned a band conductor.
Well, I first had to convince London that I could conduct as well as I could dance.
And how did you set about it?
Well, when I got over here, I got a band together, nearly all Jamaicans. We were billed as the Jamaican Emperors of Jazz, and we got stage engagements with various cinemas in the country.
Yes?
And then after a year, I reorganized the band with West Indians from all the important islands in the West Indies, a real West Indian band.
And this new venture led you where?
Well, again, we were very lucky. We got a contract to play at the Smart West End Club of Florida. We stayed there for 2 years and made some very good contacts.
And of course you started broadcasting.
Yes, at the end of those 2 years, in 1938.
And so then you really felt established.
I'm glad to say we did.
Thanks to the reach of the BBC broadcasts, news of Ken's fame spread far and wide.
Back in Guyana, he had this big name. He did very, very well. So therefore he was, to me, an inspiration, and I thought, well, one day, I used to say to myself, one day I'm going to go to Britain, I'm going to be like Ken Snake Hips Johnson. And they all used to say, oh, shut up, boy, I said, no.
What sort of impact do you think he had on the British swing scene in general?
Oh, I can't tell you. He had a great, great impact, because if you imagine in those days, here was this guy and he stood dapperly dressed in front there with his and conducted, and he was a one-off. And this was the thing that inspired not only the British people here, but a lot of us in the West Indies or wherever we were. And so that is what inspired me, no end, to try and come to this country and see if I could do similarly.
Stacked up. I'm raring to go. So take it away, the 1952 show. You know, when I think of the music of the 50s, you probably think first rock and roll. But there was another beat in the background too. The music of the Caribbean arrived with the migrant ship, the Windrush. It struck a chord with music lovers hungry for new sounds, me included. I used to love that rhythm that the Caribbean used to get, those calypsos, and the lyrics always a little bit saucy, always right up to date.
I arrived in October, so it was very cold. I came in at Paddington Station, and the first impression I had was everything was black and white. West Indians' everyday clothes was a colored thing, so I knew we were used to lots of colors in the West Indies, and I'm seeing everybody in black and white. That was really the first surprise for me, I'm sure.
Musician Russ Henderson was one of the first of the 50s immigrants who arrived on Britain's shores from all parts of the Commonwealth. They brought their skills to help boost the British workforce and a warm new sound from the West Indies. Back home, Russ's famous Calypso Quartet was considered red hot, but unfortunately his newfound digs in London were not.
When I went into bed, I jumped out and said, "There's water in the bed." It was cold, and I thought, I said no. And then they brought me a hot water bottle, and that was freezing. And when I put my pajamas, I thought it was water in the bed.
But to find a gig playing his steel pans was tough going.
It was difficult to just go and sit in any place. You couldn't get into a wide club and sit in with people. And there were few places that you can go and have a jam session. But the main place that we got our gigs, because it was a Jamaican place, it was in Carnaby Street. But Sunset Club was one, they sort of promoted that.
Another fellow musician, also from the West Indies, was Frank Holder. He was having a little more success as a singer.
I used to dance around a lot because I believed that to sing well is all right, but if you have something extra to give the public, then perhaps you'd be a bit, wanted a little bit more, as it were, you know.
Homegrown musicians were also looking for new inspiration. The 50s saw the birth of the modern British jazz movement, influenced by the bebop sounds from America, and the leading lights were the Dankworth Seven. Johnny Dankworth was the main man, and soon he spotted Frank.
John Dankworth met me in town, somewhere, I think, in Tin Pan Alley, and his words were, "Oh, you're Frank?" I said, yeah, that's me. And he said, "The boys tell me you're good." So that made me smile. I said, "Oh, really?" So I said, "Oh, well, that's good." He says, "All right, we wanted to join the Dankworth Seven." So I said, "Yes, I understand." And that's how I became part of the Dankworth Seven.
Black and white musicians happily played side by side. It was outside the cosy world of jazz where West Indian Frank Holder sometimes stood out as the black singer in an all-white band, particularly on tour when it came to finding a bed for the night.
I'm sorry we can't have you, was the words. I said, "What do you mean by you?" You know, and that was how they put it. So we had to then turn away and find somewhere else to go.
Many parts of Britain were still out of tune with the growing Caribbean community. By 1956, around 30,000 new West Indians were arriving each year, and tensions were rising. 2 years later, riots erupted in Notting Hill. White working class, often including teddy boys, attacked the homes of immigrants.
I was living Bassett Road, I'm living right off Ladbroke Grove, and one chap got killed there. Fights would break out and you don't know where it happened, you only hear another one again. But my area definitely had, Ladbroke Grove where I was living, they had a few skirmishes there.
Soon, right-wing anti-immigration groups such as the White Defence League ran campaigns to keep Britain white.
The objects of the White Defence League are to keep Britain the white man's country that it has always been, and repatriating with every humane consideration the coloured immigrants who are already here.
The jazz world could hardly stand by and watch now. Opposition to the White Defence League was led by Johnny Dankworth. He formed the Stars Campaign for Interracial Friendship, an early kind of rock against racism.
Well, the objectives of the campaign are largely to counteract any cranky organisations which try to preach the gospel of a master race anywhere, because Adolf Hitler started a similar organisation about 25 years ago, which caused the deaths of millions of people and the sufferings of millions more.
Joining him was his singing partner and part Jamaican wife, Cleo Lane.
Now, it was put to me earlier, coloured people ought to be repatriated from this country to their country of origin. Now, where were you born, for instance?
Southall or Middlesex, or Southall or Middlesex.
So you're in fact a Londoner, you're an Englishwoman?
Yes.
Where would you be if you had to be repatriated? Where would that be to?
Southall or Middlesex.
That was a difficult time, but slowly people got to realize that, you know, we're the same. In fact, I used to make a joke one time, well, not joke, I meant it. And I said, rule Britannia, because I was as British as anybody in this country.
People love the music. They try to dance it, and they would say, "Come play me a calypso." Whether they could, it took a little time to catch on. Strange song, but everybody loved it.
Watching these two guys is just fantastic. It just makes you want to dance. It makes you want to move.
Absolutely. And when you think that that music came over, and today, what do we love? A steel band.
Yeah.
What do we love? Hearing those sounds.
Yeah.
And it has continued the way through. It hasn't that it's grown or developed. It was there, and we still love it.
That's exactly right. Now, you grew up in Manchester. Was it an isolated area? Was there lots of different nationalities going on?
Lots of different nationalities, lots of different communities, and most of them immigrants from Poland, from Germany, from Russia, different backgrounds, and always very much about the family. I think immigrants, because they've had to move, they've had to travel, collectively kept grouping with their families and with their friends.
That's right. And it was the same, you know, me growing up in the East End, but I must say, I thought the music that came over from the Caribbean was absolutely wonderful, because it was something we'd never really heard. It was unique, and it was just wonderful rhythms, great lyrics. I used to love it.
Yeah, me too. And interestingly enough, we didn't have a television, but we used to go over to my grandma's house, who did have a television, and we saw Johnny Dankworth on television with Cleo Lane singing, which was just incredible. I was riveted.
Yeah. And there was another great group in those, the Deep River Boys. Do you remember them?
Yeah.
Fabulous harmonies these four guys made. Great music, I must say, and lovely.
Mac's rehearsals room opposite the Windmill Theatre. See all the guys there, Ronnie and John, everybody, fantastic,
Welcome to the Club 11!
It was a guy named Harry Morris who had an idea that we should put the musicians who were most there together. So I had a quartet and Ronnie Scott had a sextet, and that was 10 players. And Harry Morris was the 11th, so we called it the Club 11. And we hired it for one night, and we had a queue right round the building. And there were all the, you know, those hidden people who knew about this music.
Two groups of players were instantly formed.
One was led by John, and he had Bernie Fenton on piano, Joe Medell, Laurie Morgan. That was the Club 11, yeah. Exciting days they were,
And yet, the life-changing moments for some of the musicians still tended to happen abroad. In 1949, John Dankworth was playing in a club on the fringe of the Paris Jazz Festival.
And one night they said, came up to me and said that Charlie Parker was coming in and he didn't have an instrument, could you lend him your saxo? So I sort of said, "Can a duck swim?" I'd have said that in French if I'd known, but I lent him my instrument and he played it. Of course, he played it beautifully. And then he handed it all back to me like that. And I thought, well, that's the end of him. But he stood there and he stayed there and he pointed to me. And he obviously wanted me to play, so he made me play as one of the people who were playing on that particular tune, you see. So I played, and then after that I gave it back to him. As we played the tune, and everybody played 16 bars, then 8 bars, then 4 bars, so it's a bit of a laugh too. But this was, in fact, exactly the model that he played at the time. A Swedish promoter heard me in Paris and asked me to join the Sidney Bechet tour. There's a contrast for you, from the latest kid on the block, Charlie Bahaka, to probably the oldest saxophone player still operating in those days. Sidney Bechet, almost there on the ground floor. The beginning of jazz, did a tour with Bechet, and then at the end of the year, Benny Goodman asked me to play in his band at the Palladium. So I'm a bit of a relic, really. There aren't many people alive who've played with those three in the space of a few months, I suppose.
I didn't know him then, and I was too nervous to go to the Club 11. I was very young.
Clearly there were many fans who didn't care to penetrate the mysteries of Soho. So John made himself more accessible by taking to the road with the Johnny Dankworth 7, as compact an entertainment unit as you could see in the early 50s.
And suddenly he wanted a singer who could fit the bill with the 7. And the guy suggested, what about this Frank Holder? He hadn't heard of me. So he met me in Cambridge Circus, took me into a restaurant and says, the boys tell me you're good. I said, oh, that's interesting. We'd like you to join the 7. And I was dumbstruck. I said, yeah. And I was in, and that was the start of it for me.
And to compliment Frank, a girl singer, Clementina Langridge, née Campbell, from Southall, where she'd been doing semi-professional gigs at 32 shillings and sixpence a time.
I went down and sang for my audition for John down in the dungeon, which I'd never been in a jazz club down in the dungeon in London before. So it was all very exciting.
Our trumpet player, Jimmy Duke, a Scot, I'll say that in case you don't recognise the accent. When I said, do you think she's got something? He said, I think she's got everything, which was the answer, really.
Went round to the pub and they offered me, it's kind of history now, they offered me £6 and I said, make it 7, and I got it. It's not a lot of money, really. Even in those days, it wasn't a lot of money if you were going to dress yourself and keep yourself presentable on the road, which was very difficult to do because there wasn't any one-day cleaners in those days.
Time, gentlemen, please.
A point not many male band leaders would have cared to consider. The social mix in Southall was very different in those days. Cleo's was apparently the only Jamaican English family in the area.
My mother hoped that I might become a dancer, but I didn't have the body. I had the vocals, but not the body. The myth in the family was that I sang the song, Let's All Sing the Barmaid Song.
Let's all sing the barmaid song. Let's all sing the barmaid song.
So I must have been starstruck at a very, very early age.
Gentlemen, please.
Her biggest musical influence was her father, Alec, a good singer and an alert listener to songs on the radio.
In my current show, when I was singing, I'd tell the audience about my father and then say that from him, when I started as a professional, I had a repertoire to die for, and it was my father that taught me all those old songs that were wonderful, really.
Cleo's first link with big time was an appearance as an urchin in the 1940 film The Thief of Baghdad, starring Sabu, the elephant boy.
I fell in love with Sabu. I thought that after doing the film, of course, that was it. He was my idol, and I like to see everything that he did, Elephant Boy and all those films.
Tonight, Cleo Lane, Britain's top jazz singer. This is your lady.
Oh God! They got him in as a guest. flew him all the way from LA. That was one of my big surprises. It was I didn't know hardly anybody that they brought on. You had to act. I had to act. Oh yes, of course I remember.
And I was trying to do my serious speech, you know. It was Leo and I, we looked at everywhere except at each other. And then somehow when I started to make my speech, my eyes would catch hers and she would burst out giggling.
What was the director's reaction by now?
Well, after about 4 retakes, he lost his temper.
Not even the life of a Baghdad urchin could prepare Cleo for trips in the bandwagon of the Dankworth Seven.
They used to tell jokes and sing very strange songs from time to time. This was all very, very high living for me, travelling in a coach with all those blokes.
Some of whose games and pastimes on the road were truly eccentric.
We had newts where we all sort of crawled about and we pretended we were newts in a tank, like in an aquarium or a zoo or something, and they crawl over each other, don't they? They sort of stop. They tread over each other. And we used to do this and get in these ridiculous tangles, all just clambering over each other, and never get stopped for about 30 seconds, then one would move again, you know, another bit. And I don't know what game there was in that, it was just stupid.
While these indignities were happening, Cleo was often being tutored by Frank Holder.
We used to sit together in the coach, you know, and John says, well, you're just thinking, you're a teacher. She really came on, she learned very, very quickly.
He kind of tarted me up a bit, so he thought. I'm not sure that it worked. I wasn't tart-uppable, really.
Such was the success of the Dankworth Seven that the leader felt bold enough to go for expansion, against the trend of the times, because big bands in general had been struggling for years.
I vowed I'd do all the arrangements except the waltzes, but I also very quickly found that I was taking on something I just couldn't do, that there was far too much writing to do with all the broadcasts we were doing to one person to do it. So one of the players brought a feature in, and David Lindup had done the arrangement to it.
Dave Lindup became a fixture in the organisation. It was often said that what Billy Strayhorn was to Duke Ellington, Lindup became to Dankworth. But first, an interruption and a political eye-opener for John.
I was asked to do a tour of South Africa solo with an South African trio. I was young enough in those days to want to see the world, so it seemed a good idea at the time. I knew that there was a lot of racial injustice in America, but I didn't equate it with South Africa for some reason or other. It wasn't in the headlines in those days, you know, people didn't talk about it.
During the trip, John much enjoyed a classical recital by a young black pianist called Sol Claster. But shortly before a concert of his own, he was amazed to find Claster shuffling around the corridors in menial attire.
So I said, what if you've got that brown coat on and a broom, what are you doing? So he said, well, I'm an unofficial helper, but they've let me come in so I can pretend to be sweeping up so I can hear you play. That touched me deeply, and then I realised, you know, it all began to sink in what this system was and how unacceptable it was to me.
Not until the present century did Dankworth return to South Africa. It was a relief to get back to the big band, one or two members of which still play in Dankworth lineups.
Sometimes we even did two in the same night, you know, we do an ordinary sort of dance type program and then one that was more jazz oriented afterwards, you know. So I mean, these days you can't imagine that a band would actually do two in the same night, you know, but we used to, you know, it's great.
Big band hits were rare, but Johnny Dankworth scored one, a George Martin production, Experiments with Mice, a well-known nursery rhyme played in the styles of several other bands.
This is the saga of 3 blind mice who lived in a recording studio. They called the first one Billy May.
Well, it was everyone you could think of, I think, you know, Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, well, Stan Kenton, obviously, you know. We might have done even more than that, you know, but it was quite something.
The personal lives of John and Cleo had not yet intertwined. By the middle 50s, Cleo's first marriage, from which she had a son, Stuart, had collapsed, but it hadn't been apparent that she and John would get together.
No, it was not apparent. I'm sure they said it wasn't at all apparent. Because, you see, several reasons. John was, in a way, on his own. He was a leader, and, you know, he was a very quiet, and if I may say, to some extent, shy person in those days. Very quiet, carried on himself, very gentlemanly. So, he used to be sort of more or less on his own, as I say, most of the time. And what was he doing? Writing a lot of the arrangement, or getting the ideas up.
Then I'll do 4 bars. Send off there, and then maybe just
guide up the last time, then, isn't it?
no, last 2 quavers, eh? Sorry. Then what can we do? After that, I send off for Adam for 2 bars. Then 16 bars. 16 bars just Alan and bass. How about that?
The band was doing well, but